I just wish more games understood what made Super Metroid so great. It's not the speed running, or the sequence breaking, or the item progression, or the level design, or the secret moves, or the entirely skippable yet vital items, or the million little details that help sell the world.
Yay!
For most any narrative medium, be it books, comics, movies, stage plays, television, whatever, the ultimate goal of the story is to connect with the audience in one of two ways. There's sympathy, in which the audience feels for the subject, and there's empathy, in which the audience feels with the subject. Sympathy is like when you play The Last of Us, get caught by a bloater, and you wince because you're like, ooh, that's gotta hoit. You feel for Joel. Empathy is like at the end of The Last of Us when Joel says,
I swear.
and you can see the look in Ellie's eyes, and you know she knows that Joel's lying to her, but then she says,
Okay.
and because you've spent the last 15 hours with these two characters, watch them struggle and suffer and bond, this hits you like a ton of bricks because you understand why they would lie to each other. You feel with them. But I think video games are capable of a third emotional connection with their audience, one that no other artistic medium has the ability to create due to their interactive nature. Because if sympathy is feeling for a character and empathy is feeling with a character, what do you call it when you feel as a character? So what do I mean by that? Well, for starters, I don't mean immersion, or when a player is deeply drawn into the game-playing experience. You can be fully immersed in winning a match in Rocket League, as I often am, it's one of my favorite games, but that's not really a narrative. Even then, a game can have a great story and be incredibly immersive, but still fall short of what I'm talking about. I consider Uncharted 4 one of the best stories ever told in a video game. No, I am not joking, I will scientifically prove it one day, but while I may sympathize with Nate during the gameplay and empathize with Nate in the cutscenes, I never really feel like I am Nathan Drake during the gameplay. We're not emotionally connected on a deeper level beyond whiz-bang action excitement. I also don't mean ludonarrative, either dissonance or harmony, a term that's commonly misinterpreted, having more to do with the gameplay and theme marching in unison, and little to do with the player and player character. No, what I'm talking about hasn't really been examined in great detail before, or at least not in the few research papers I was able to find. So I'm just going to go ahead and give it a name. If sympathy is feeling for a character and empathy is feeling with a character, then synergy is feeling as a character. I don't know, I could be wrong, and this is already a well-established concept in game design, and if that's the case, I'm sure someone will post about it in the comments, but for now, it's mine, it's synergy, and I think this new way of connecting with the audience started way back in 1994 when Super Metroid released for the SNES. And yes, I said each individual letter of SNES out loud. I don't quite know when people began calling it the SNES or SNES. That just gives me an unpleasant mouthfeel. It reminds me of that one episode of South Park.
Miss Clinton, it appears that terrorists have snuck a snook up your sniz.
Oh my!
And I don't like it. But let's be honest with ourselves, oh savvy consumer of digital media, you've probably already watched a Super Metroid retrospective by King K, or Liam Triforce, or The Geek Critique, or The Completionist, or Game Maker's Toolkit, or this blue Muppet thing? Yes, this is a real channel, and no, I am not at all jealous of their subscriber count. The truth is, throw a rock in any direction on the internet, and it's more likely than not you'll hit someone talking about Super Metroid. This is a conversation we've been having for almost 30 years now.
Almost every game now has some Super Metroid lodged in it somewhere, like a splinter.
What could I possibly have to add that hasn't already been said? Well, to explain what I mean by synergy, let's examine how Super Metroid delivers its narrative, how that method of delivery creates synergy between the player and player character, and how each new entry of the Metroid series moved further and further away from what made Super Metroid such a classic.
The last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
Super Metroid begins with Samus recounting the events from the previous two games, stopping the space pirates from turning the titular Metroids, a species capable of draining energy from any life form, into bioweapons, because that always works out. then exterminating every last living Metroid on their home planet, save one. And let's be honest here, we kind of paint this as an altruistic act, like she didn't want to exterminate a species. That bitch was just trying to grab the bag, then quietly escorting it all the way back up to the surface of planet SR388. And you know what, I'll say it, I ain't scared. Metroid 2 Return of Samus, it's the original Hotline Miami. She then drops the hatchling off at a research facility where they learn that the creatures are capable of producing energy. Samus then dips out but quickly returns after receiving a distress signal, only to discover all the scientists are freshly dead. And you know, as a 9-year-old kid, I used to crouch down and aim at the bodies as if Samus were checking their vital signs, which, look, I'm not saying I came up with the scan visor from Metroid Prime a full 18 years before it debuted, but also...
You're welcome, Earth!
Venturing further into the station, Samus discovers the hatchling before being attacked by Ridley. And while you can't lose this fight because Ridley zooms off once Samus's health becomes critical, you can win by damaging Ridley enough until it drops the hatchling, but then also zooms off. Also, I never noticed until recording for this video that when Ridley flies at the screen, he pushes Samus out of the way, which, I mean, what a great touch. The game's just full of those. And I promise I'm not going to go over the entire game in this kind of detail. Again, we've all been here. You've either played or watched a video about Super Metroid, so I know you know this. I'm just laying the groundwork for my argument. We're going to go much faster pretty soon. The self-destruct sequence is activated and Samus has 1 minute to escape as the station crumbles around her. The SNES Super FX chip even gets to flex some muscle in this shaft as it careens from side to side, making the escape extra harrowing. Afterwards, Samus follows Ridley to planet Zebes, the homeworld of the space pirates back from Metroid 1. And also, I guess, her home planet before the space pirates took over. I mean, Super Metroid doesn't care about that, but that becomes important to the lore later, which we'll get there. She lands on the planet's surface and... that's about it as far as story goes for the remainder of the game. From this moment on, the player is in control until the credits roll. No dialogue, no cutscenes, no text boxes, save for when you pick up a new item. It's just you, Samus, and the environment. The player is largely left to their own devices, though that's not to say there aren't scripted gameplay moments. Super Metroid's chock full of them, like the opening sequence after you make Planetfall, where everything is dark and mysterious. Samus's visor dimly glowing as she explores the abandoned caverns until you get the morph ball and...
surveillance camera?
Or these cute animals who teach Samus how to wall jump and shine spark without a single word of text. Not this ugly mug though. It just spins at you for getting close to its babies. Although you do get an energy tank out of it. Thanks, ugly turtle. There's these insects that scuttle away inside a long derelict ship, or the particularly gruesome death of this magma dial who then wades through the lava. Look, you can see the bubbles right there. I love it. He then tries to jump scare you, but nope, just kidding. He's actually dead. But check out this goofy noise when he crumbles. Or these hungry little assholes that latch onto you and start to drain your energy. After you take care of them, you can find an energy tank in the room, hinting that the creatures were actually drawn to it all along. Environmental storytelling. I love it. Or this screen right here. This is easily my favorite screen in the entire game. Just look at it. Notice how most of the foreground, Samus included, is obscured by hanging seaweed, drawing the attention to a pile of what I assume to be eggs, perfectly placed according to the rule of thirds. When you enter from the left, the eggs are directly in front of your path, so player gonna play, you start blasting. Only able to hit a single egg at a time, which means breaking the whole pile takes a couple of seconds before you can move on to the next room, which locks you in with a gang of indestructible space pirates, but luckily the plasma beam upgrade is there as well. Once acquired, you're able to take out the pirates, which unlocks the door back to the elegant egg room. Again, your first instinct is to shoot, where you then discover that the plasma beam passes through all the eggs at once. It's so quiet, so understated, especially compared to the way later Metroids bombastically introduce their own plasma beams. I would print this screen out, put it in a frame, and hang it on my wall. It's that much of a work of art. But the question remains, why would I choose Super Metroid as the tipping point for when games delivered stories unique to any other media? After all, it's not a particularly deep or complicated story, it's just one lady's policing of a violent gang of street youths. Hell, just 1994 alone saw medium-defining games like Final Fantasy VI and its Opera House scene, Earthbound's postmodernist take on the Dragon Quest formula, and Tokimeki Memorial, which Tim Rogers tells me is great, but...
Mother of mercy, I don't speak Japanese!
What about Super Metroid separates it from its more ambitious peers? Well, it's Super Metroid's scripted gameplay moments, which function more like interactive cutscenes that keep control in the player's hands. This is crucial as the player stays fully immersed, like any good game does,
Surveillance camera.
but also carefully blurs the line between what's gameplay and what's narrative, setting the player up for an unforgettable finale. You enter a room that immediately feels off. Littered about are the desiccated corpses of various enemies who crumble to dust at the lightest touch. The pre-boss encounter music plays in the background, signaling something dangerous is just around the corner. Then a creature hops, practically limps on screen when suddenly... There's a reason this moment's remembered so fondly in gaming history, and I argue it's because this scene right here is where synergy between a player and a player character was born. It's a scripted moment, yes, so it's essentially a cutscene, but a first-time player won't know that due to Super Metroid brilliantly blurring the line between gameplay and story, and keeping that line blurred all the way up to this moment. Better still, this moment is interactive. The giant Metroid hovers above, completely impervious to any of Samus's attacks, and the player is able to dodge a couple of them before the giant Metroid finally pounces onto Samus and begins draining her of her life. Even now, the player is still in control, able to frantically run about, crouch, try to shoot missiles, lay bombs, whatever to shake this thing loose. Again, I was 9 when I first played Super Metroid, and this moment freaked me the fuck out, which I'd argue reflects the terror that Samus feels. In this moment, through gameplay and story beats, you and Samus experience the same emotions. The player feels as Samus, the same horror, but also the same confusion when, with only one health point left, the giant Metroid lets go and starts to make a familiar sound. It then follows after Samus like a lost child until she leaves the room or she tries to attack it, which will make it run away. This one scene communicates so much: apprehension, shock, terror, confusion, realization, and maybe even relief, all without saying a single word. Everything has been delivered through gameplay alone, and that is one hell of an accomplishment. Let's fast forward a bit. You've made your way to the heart of Planet Zebes and finally come face to face with Mother Brain. After breaking her glass enclosure and pumping her full of missiles, she collapses, only to rise back up with a new body, and the battle reignites. Everything about this fight is perfect, straight down to the freaky Frankenstein-style music. Mother Brain can be a tricky fight, but things don't become dire until... This, of course, is another scripted moment, but once again, a first-time player won't know that. In situations like this, a player's instinct is to hammer on the controller buttons, and Super Metroid's masterstroke gives the player the illusion they are still in control, even now. If you push the buttons, Samus struggles to get back up, tricking the player into thinking recovery is possible, which then drives them to wail on that fucking controller like their life depends on it. Or the player could just give up, accepting that they've lost the fight and wait for the killing blow to drop. Either is canon, the player and character in complete emotional synergy, as Mother Brain charges up a final death blow, but... And yet, Super Metroid isn't done. As the baby Metroid re-energizes Samus, Mother Brain slowly comes back to life, first indicated by a venomous drip of the fangs, until she rises back up and lays into the hatchling, ultimately giving its life to protect you. Samus' suit is then flooded with hyperbeam energy that the Metroid transferred over from Mother Brain, calling back to the game's introduction. As the overworld theme kicks in and finally, triumphantly, Super Metroid gives you a minute to just...
You got knocked the fuck out!
This sequence is legendary, a drop-dead, pitch-perfect capstone to everything that built up to it. A synergistic connection between the player and Samus that ranges the whole emotional spectrum from stress, desperation, elation, sorrow, and finally, blind rage. Every single step of the process shared between the player and Samus. This absolute masterpiece of an ending is what elevates Super Metroid from a great game that single-handedly invented a genre while simultaneously establishing many gameplay conventions that still exist to this day, minor stuff like that, to a jaw-dropping narrative experience that you feel down to the marrow of your bones like nothing that ever came before it. Super Metroid committed to delivering an entire story arc full of highs and lows, twists and turns, jump scares and jokes, solely through its gameplay and Nintendo.
I nailed it. I nailed it.
And you know what? I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. That's right, Kakarot! This was secretly a Citizen Kane video all along! I promise I'm not going to go too hard on this because I know a lot of gamers have an allergic reaction to the Citizen Kane of games debate, and I get it. I get it. It's a discussion that overstayed its welcome almost immediately, but I do think it's an important one to have because of what it means for video games as a unique art. My voice is kind of gone after going Super Saiyan. When asking, what's the Citizen Kane of games? A lot of people tend to interpret this question as, what is the best game of all time, or the most cinematic? Which is how games like Metal Gear Solid, or Bioshock, or Ocarina of Time, or something a bit more art house like Shadow of the Colossus get picked. After all, Citizen Kane's the greatest movie of all time, right? That's what makes it Citizen Kane. I'm gonna let you in on a little secret here. Nobody below the age of 85 actually thinks Citizen Kane is the best movie of all time, especially in a world where sudden death exists. The Citizen Kane of games shouldn't be the best or the most cinematic or the most art house because none of those apply to Citizen Kane itself. No, what makes Citizen Kane the greatest, not the best, but the greatest, is because it was the first film to realize the full potential of cinema as their own unique artistic medium, separate from paintings and radio and theater, yet encompassing all of those, and did it so well that it gives movies released today a legitimate run for their money. That might sound like a bold claim for a movie that came out in 1941, but seriously, have any of you ever watched Citizen Kane? It's great! Not great for its time or any other caveat like that. It's great, full stop, which is wild when you take into consideration how much it innovated. For a movie like Citizen Kane to emerge fully formed, utilizing everything that came before it to declare that this is what the art form can be, it's astonishing. And I'll be goddamned if that doesn't summarize Super Metroid to a T. Super Metroid isn't the Citizen Kane of games because it gets the player invested in a boss battle or to press the controller buttons really fast. Many games have gotten many players to do that before and since. Games prior to Super Metroid tended to have clear boundaries between their gameplay and storytelling, or in the case of the rare few to mix the two together, would do so in ways that didn't take full advantage of the medium. What makes Super Metroid the Citizen Kane of games is that it was the first to understand the psychological effects gameplay would have on a player and used them to connect them with Samus, to get the player to feel what Samus feels, to create synergy in service of a story that, while admittedly generic, was one only a video game could tell. And it still holds up to this day. Legitimately one of the best games of all time. Not one of those fake-ass pretenders that people continue to put high up on the list because they played it to death as a kid. True, the game isn't perfect. For one, the map is pretty bare bones, providing no clues as to where doors are, or if an item has been picked up or not, only indicating that an item is, or has previously been, on that spot. There's also a couple of pathfinding pain points that a new player may not be able to easily figure out, like hidden paths behind walls, or if you can't remember an area you need to return to with a new ability, like how I forgot about these power bomb blocks right here.
You took 4 minutes of my life and I want them back. Oh, I'd only waste them anyway.
Or this glass tube that gives zero indication that it can be broken to open up a new path. 9-year-old me only figured this out after I was so hopelessly stuck that I started rage-laying power bombs all over the place and shattered it completely by accident. Yes, I know there's a second glass tube that's already broken as a hint, but that's a pretty obscure hint, and I was 9. Cut me some slack. GameFAQs wasn't a thing back then. I'm not even sure if GameFAQs is a thing right now. But beyond those couple nitpicks, Super Metroid is an astonishingly smooth, compact experience well worth playing today that clocks in at just under 5 hours. Maybe 7 if you want to be a completionist about these things, or if you didn't realize you had to break the glass fucking tube! I just wish more games understood what made Super Metroid so great. It's not the speed running, or the sequence breaking, or the item progression, or the level design, or the secret moves, or the entirely skippable yet vital items, or the million little details that help sell the world. Like the glowing orb on the back of Samus's hand that you'll only see if you're facing to the left and aiming downward while standing in the dark. Or the hidden methods to insta-kill bosses, or the alternate ending where you rescue the cute animals who then fly off in their own escape shuttle. See? There they go. Which I didn't even know about until I made this video 30 years later. Why does nobody talk about this alternate ending? Or the fact that the final boss farts rockets out of her armpits. All of those are, of course, part of the formula, but it's the synergy created between player and player character, the emotional journey you go on with Samus, as Samus, that makes Super Metroid the greatest. Because, to be completely honest, not even Super Metroid's own sequels seem to understand this. It's no secret that Metroid Fusion, released 8 years later in 2002 for the Game Boy Advance, has an overabundance of exposition that could be described as serviceable if we're being very generous. Nintendo, legitimately at a loss for how to top the greatness that was Super Metroid, pivoted to a different, more story-forward approach, resulting in frequent gameplay breaks that see you locked in a room with an AI named Adam Malkovich. Yeah, Malkovich.
Malkovich.
Who gives Samus her next set of objectives, chastises her for deviating from the proscribed path, conspires with shadowy figures, argues with her over the nature of humanity, and it's just as bad as you remember if you've played it, and just as bad as you've heard if you haven't. Which is a shame, because when it's not delivering reams of Diet Metal Gear Solid-like dialogue, or straight up copying Super Metroid in its final minutes, Metroid Fusion possesses a strong identity of its own, more akin to survival horror than a Metroidvania, and is filled to the brim with really clever, synergy-inducing scripted gameplay moments, much more so than Super Metroid even. Moments like the SAX stalking the halls, hunting Samus down, or an elevator suddenly losing power, forcing you to find an alternate route, or when you shoot a Chozo statue for an upgrade and this happens, or when Samus discovers a secret lab full of Metroids that the Federation plans on turning into bioweapons, because that always works out, or the mimics. This game has mimics, you guys, which means, that's right, Metroid Fusion is the Dark Souls of the Metroid series.
Hang on, let me just check this box right here, and that looks pretty good.
Honestly, if it weren't for all the terrible pace-grinding, synergy-blocking dialogue, Metroid Fusion would probably be a better game than Super Metroid, and I don't say that lightly. It's fantastic when it's smart enough to get out of its own way. Metroid Zero Mission, released 2 years later in 2004, was a bit of a course correction from Fusion, as almost all in-game dialogue and cutscenes were tossed aside with a new focus on delivering a rock-solid, if safe, classic Metroid experience. Unfortunately, Zero Mission also tossed out most of the scripted gameplay moments and the synergy that comes along with them that were Super and Fusion's bread and butter. This holds true until you beat Mother Brain, trigger the now obligatory escape sequence, hop in your ship, and find yourself in the middle of a space pirate fleet. They shoot Samus down, who crashes back on planet Zebes, armed only with a dinky little stun gun and, her wits to protect her. Questionable fashion choices aside, the Zero Suit Samus sequence is exhilarating. An extended game of cat and mouse that sees you running from nigh invincible space pirates, forced to hide in vents and shadowy corners, in a non-stop series of scripted gameplay moments, including a space pirate making off with the powerbomb upgrade that's gonna have a player going, "That's mine." This sequence plays out just long enough without overstaying its welcome until you acquire a fully kitted out suit with the deadliest of Samus's weapons, now allowing you to tear through every space pirate foolish enough to get in your way as if they were made of wet tissue paper.
That was awesome.
It takes the player from Samus's lowest low to highest power trippingest high, before making her escape in a riveting extended example of story delivered through gameplay, aside from the flashbacks. The flashbacks are dumb. 13 years later, Mercury Steam released Metroid: Samus Returns for the Nintendo 3DS, a remake of the original Game Boy's Metroid 2: Return of Samus, and it's fine. It's a fine game. It doesn't really do anything to stand out from the rest of the pack. It still has the isolated atmosphere the series is known for, occasionally punctuated by the chirp of an aliens-like radar system used to hunt down and exterminate all 40 Metroids that inhabit planet SR-388. Speaking of aliens, the Metroid Queen is really well designed, a great mixture of the alien and grotesque. It's definitely a fun game, but Samus Returns is probably the weakest entry in the entire series, devoid of its own unique hook like Fusion's Horror or Zero Mission's Butt Cheeks. Mercury Steam also removed the quiet trek back up to the surface, so you can't even call this a Hotline Miami-like anymore. They also threw in a Ridley boss fight for no reason other than to have that thing you like from that old game in this new game so you like the thing, which, to be fair, Fusion was guilty of as well, both having Ridley and the cute aliens. What, did the ugly little turtle babies not make it on the last flight out of Zebus? Poor ugly little turtle babies. Samus Returns is still a good game, don't get me wrong, but thanks to cutscenes constantly breaking up the gameplay, there's almost no synergy to speak of, so really there's not much else to speak on. Then Metroid Dread released for the Nintendo Switch in 2021, and
Oh no, we're into the dregs.
listen, Metroid Dread is a great game, some even calling it the best in the series, which I think a bit of recency bias is at play there, but I can't deny Metroid Dread is a ton of fun. Samus has never felt better to control, each movement executed with the reflexes of a cat and the speed of a mongoose. I also genuinely love the harder turn combat takes, with some of the fights requiring reflexes much quicker than I'd expect from a Nintendo product. You better get used to this screen, let me tell you. But once you rise to the challenge, you really do feel like an apex predator on a hostile world that's got me acting like,
I'm not locked in here with you.
You're locked in here with me!
but the story? In my honest opinion, Metroid Dread's story is the worst of the bunch. Beginning with an overlong series recap, providing the flimsiest of excuses to kick off events, employing a nonsensical flash forward, but also a flash back, which won't even be explained until the final boss fight, and the return of everyone's favorite AI monotone drone, Adam Malkovich, who you are repeatedly locked in a room with and forced to talk to again.
Locked in here with me!
Did we learn nothing from Metroid Fusion? Metroid Dread's story is the kind of mess that results from attempting to tie up an entire series worth of loose ends that really should have just been cut off by now. I know there's some lore hounds out there who were dying to know more about Samus's past and her relationship to the Chozo, and loved learning there's different factions of Chozo, and some have the ability to control Metroids, and how Metroids and X-Parasites counteract each other, and on and on and on. So this was undoubtedly catnip to those people. But as I expressed in my video on Horizon Zero Dawn, I really do not care for lore, especially when a story's backstory overtakes a story's story. Now, I'm gonna make a statement that might annoy some of the Samus stans out there, but Metroid's lore is nonsensical, and only gets dumber the more it's explained. You tell me a space lady can upgrade her suit picking up these little doodad items? Great, that's all I need. I simply did not care for Captain Falcon here, whose real name is, I shit you not, Ravenbeak.
It's like calling a Chinese person Asia face.
I didn't care for the reveal it's his DNA Samus is infused with, and that's why she's such a badass. And I especially did not care for his ridiculous plan to put Samus through hell in order to awaken her Metroid DNA and make a clone army of Samus bioweapons, because that always works out. Which, by the way, was the exact same twist from Metroid Fusion. Have we learned nothing? Worse, the line between what's story and what's gameplay is no longer blurred but crystal clear as cutscene after cutscene takes control out of the player's hands to deliver exposition, introduce characters, reveal boss monsters, and do its best Raiden cosplay, while hardly ever giving the player a scripted gameplay moment beyond draining water out of a room or escaping a collapsing surface, or when an enemy introduces itself with a power bomb blast, which was actually pretty cool, until it immediately turned into a cutscene. It's cutscenes all the way down in Metroid Dread, culminating in one-shotting the last boss as if this were directed by Shinji Mikami.
Game over.
But not in a good way. Once again, the gameplay is great. It's the most open-ended Metroid in terms of sequence breaks and speedrunning, and Samus herself has never looked cooler. I smiled from ear to ear when she casually blasted Kraid in the mouth like he ain't shit. And it even has a glass tube. Hello, old friend. But as the game went on, I realized more and more that any significant story beat was reserved for cutscene Samus and not for the Samus controlled by me, the player, which makes all the difference in the world. You might think I'm overemphasizing the importance of narrative delivered through gameplay, but consider this. How different would the giant Metroid attack or Mother Brain's Hyper Beam feel if the player knew they were simply cutscenes? If, knowing them to be non-interactive, the player passively watched it happen instead of continuing to fight for survival? There's something about controlling a character's actions during an emotionally charged story beat that makes it land differently. At least to me it does. You see, not only am I a failed writer, but I was also a failed actor. So I'm used to inhabiting a role and feeling what a character feels. So maybe I just take to it easier than some folk. But the fact remains that narratives in games are almost a form of acting, asking you to play your part, hit your marks, deliver your lines, but without knowing the script ahead of time. You're supposed to just feel it in the moment. I can't even really say I liked The Last Guardian all that much until the final moment when I realized I had to White Fang Trico.
Go back to your kind!
Are you white fanging me?
And all of a sudden I found myself sobbing. Yes, sobbing. I cry at video games. It's okay. You can too. Whereas had it stayed a passive cutscene, The Last Guardian probably wouldn't have affected me nearly as much as it did. The same could be said for the Joker's reveal in Arkham Knight. The developers expertly placed the player in Batman's headspace through careful gameplay mechanics before shocking them.
Miss me?
With undoubtedly the same shock Batman felt in that moment. Or the infamous microwave hallway in Metal Gear Solid 4. Say what you will about this insane mess of a game, as many have, but Hideo Kojima and crew nailed this one single moment, forcing the player through a grueling 2-minute-long quick time event wherein Solid Snake literally cooks in front of your eyes, as pain radiates up the player's forearm and their hand begins to cramp. A physical echo of what Snake is going through. I mean, it's too bad this nonsense is occurring just above the screen, but what can I say? The game's a mess. The entire survival horror genre lives or dies.
That was a humor joke.
On synergy. If the player is not inextricably linked to the character's psychology, then the game just ceases to be scary. Then there's games that go for more nuanced themes and emotions, communicated through gameplay mechanics, such as Papers, Please, which forces you to compromise your morals with tight time constraints and dying family members until you're just another cog in an authoritarian machine. Or Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons, that eliminates access to an entire side of the controller to symbolize the loss of a loved one, only to give it back in a truly transformative moment that still gets me like. Or Red Dead Redemption, the first game that made me consider how video game narratives function differently from all other media. John Marston's futile last stand was a punch to the gut, to be sure, intensified by the fact that the player's in control and can hope against hope that 6 bullets are somehow enough to take down a dozen armed men. But it was what came after that rocked me to my core. Assuming control of John's son Jack and feeling an overwhelming rush of rage, bereavement, aimlessness, and even hatred towards Jack himself simply for not being John, the man I just spent over 50 hours with. I wanted to to rage. I wanted to raise hell. I wanted to ride into the nearest town and shoot every last man, woman, and child until a single thought ripped through my head. Dad wouldn't want that. Not John. Dad. It was in that moment I realized that Jack must feel every last one of these emotions too, up to and including self-loathing. That was the first time I realized that game made me feel what a character felt as they were feeling it. These games and many others besides have permanently burned themselves into my brain, but they're not enough. Not nearly enough. Citizen Kane may be the greatest film of all time, but movies have only gotten better since then. Super Metroid showed us the way, that games can create synergy between player and character to tell stories that no other medium is capable of. But I feel that rather than taking the true lesson that Super Metroid had to teach us, the one about synergy, video games instead took lessons about level design and item progression and the Metroidvania genre as a whole. And as a result, video games have only begun to scratch the surface of what their narratives can deliver. But if the games I've mentioned are any indication, they're getting there. The future looks bright, and I cannot wait to play what comes next. And so, with all of that out of the way and the great Citizen Kane of games debate finally settled, only one question remains. What's the sudden death of video games?